So thanks everyone for showing up today. Today I'll do a summary dissertation. It's a doctoral thesis that I've been writing since 21 and that I handed in last year. This month it was officially published and is now freely available as a PDF, so you can click on my social profile for the download link for that, or you can go to the entrance of this world. So the main focus of this whole project lies on you guys, basically. So long-term, experienced and enthusiast VRChat users. Essentially, I chose to follow you guys around and learn from you about what everyday life in VRChat looks like. Initially, that was also the entire research goal as well, just this vague question about how everyday life in VR functions. Later on, however, I decided on two main research questions that are a bit more specific. How do long-term VRChat users experience virtual bodies and worlds, and how do they shape and negotiate their everyday social interactions? The first question is about how avatars and virtual spaces feel to long-term users while they spend time in VRChat. And the second one is about their social behavior. My book has... Oh, I think I skipped something there. Yeah. My book has 9 chapters, but the last is a summary chapter, so it's really 8 chapters. And these 8 chapters are subdivided into 3 large parts. The intro part gives some general info about VR, social VR, and the concepts of cyberspace and virtual communities. VRChat and VRC users are also described very shortly in there as well. I also did a literature review of hundreds of social VR research papers that were written since the early 90s, which I summarize in the second chapter of the book. My main takeaway from that is basically that social VR research does not that often look at actual VR users. Instead, it follows a more controlled case study setup most of the time in university laboratories where VR newcomers are subjected to VR hardware. And as everyone that is here right now can probably guess, that will lead to very different results compared to surveying and observing people who use the tech regularly. A long method section in chapter 3 caps off that intro part, and it goes over how I got my data and the philosophy behind doing participant research online. Part 2 and 3 are bundled together to answer the research questions that I showed earlier, so I will focus mostly on those two today. To give you guys a little behind the scenes of my methods, ethnography is basically the approach that I followed for this book. It's a way of research where you enter certain communities to find out about their way of life. But not as like a short-term journalist, but more in a way where you generally try to become part of the communities you research. Essentially, I followed a very similar path to you guys when you found VRChat. But what I did differently is that I also interviewed other users and collected notes and data along the way in order to kind of chronicle and analyze everything that I and those around me were experiencing. Around 4 years, I spent multiple nights a week in VRChat, mostly in clubs. And the reason for that was I monitored some groups initially when I joined VRChat, and clubgoers seemed to have the highest concentration of highly invested VR enthusiasts that I could find, which is why I followed them most of the time. There was also a high emphasis on bodies, and that was particularly interesting to me as well. And lastly, nightlife is kind of a melting pot for every other community as well. I've met lots of other people from creator, photography, role-playing, art, and other communities through the events I was part of over the years. And in total, I did 32 ethnographic interviews with other users in that time. That doesn't really sound that much if you think about that I've been doing this for years, but it is a lot considering how that data was later processed. I followed a guideline named grounded theory in my work, which basically means that everything I write about needs to be grounded in actual behavior and experiences that I witness firsthand or that people around me tell me about. I analyzed my interviews and my recordings and memo data in a qualitative data software called MaxQDA. In total, I made over 7,000 notes and theory memos inside that program, and later on I used simple mind maps to collect my main findings and kind of write my theoretical arguments that are now in the book. all interviews and data that I collected essentially look like this in my program. You can think of it as a sort of academic text marking. Initially, I just mark what seems important to me, and then I add possible interpretations of that section later on, which then get more specific each time I go over the data. My interview transcripts are over 800 pages long, and I went over every spoken word countless times throughout these years. In the end, the quotes you see in the book were chosen out of hundreds of others from these markings. And the transcripts I used are available for everyone to read in full if you are insane enough to spend your free time on that. Okay, so let's get into the actual findings of the book. Even though both are connected, I chose to subdivide the spatial and embodied experience of VRC users for better analyzing the experience overall. To describe how long-term users experience space when inside VRC, I use the term bilocation. It describes the feeling of being a singular body that navigates two spaces at once, a digital and a material one, with aspects of both worlds often colliding. And I found that this experience changes over time for people, and that long-term users experience and navigate space in VRChat much differently than newcomers. That is because people learn to synthesize an initially pretty confusing and fragmented spatial perception into a new whole over time. The result is a way of perceiving space where being in VR and being at home are no longer necessarily opposed. Instead, both spaces remain important for everyday life in VRChat. This finding breaks with one of the most popular assumptions in social VR research, and that is the idea that experiencing anything or being aware of anything besides the virtual world will break immersion. I had this realization, funnily enough, while I was drinking in VR with friends. And for long-term users, two spaces actually stop being separate after a while, and furniture or objects at home find their uses inside VR again. As a consequence, the use of transitional objects, as I call them in the book, for example, drinks at home, a chair, or a dancing pole, for example, they actually serve the situation and make it more immersive for people, instead of, so to speak. However, there's also a lot of knowledge needed to recognize these hybrid situations that you see up there for what they are. You could show this clip to someone uninitiated, and not many would grasp the extent of what is actually going on there. VRChat users learn how to bracket this bilocation through lived experience and share that knowledge amongst themselves. That's how you guys can cheers to friends with seemingly empty hands while hovering midair, and think of that situation as totally normal and obvious. It's ingrained in VRChat community's way of life. I will add as well that bilocation has some particular side effects in communities with intercontinental overlap, which is also why we're doing this event so late. It also affects people's time perception. There's a relational time that people assume to share with others when they are in presence. After all, for all of human history, those who share a space and each other's presence also share that space as time. That doesn't really happen in VR, though. You can easily be 10 hours apart time zone-wise while sharing bodily co-presence with someone in VRChat. I only touch on this very shortly in the book, but that's a future project that I plan to write more about. And lastly, for the space chapter, I explain how social VR worlds become meaningful for long-term users. For example, how they fulfill the roles of third or safe spaces for some users, and how they are perceived as spatially distinct, meaning that users can reminisce about them close to how they would local bars or parks and not game worlds or websites. Many theories in the 90s that were written about the social internet of the future imagine it as something like this. So a spatially distinct but still digital and global social site. That's where these imaginaries of cyberspace and metaverse originated too. I finish my analysis of virtual spaces by pointing out that spatial perception is always tied to the body. Or in this case, in our case, the avatar that kind of anchors us in the spaces that we perceive. In terms of embodiment, and this is maybe the largest slide that I have, in terms of embodiment, is it not showing for you guys?
It shows.
Nope.
Ah, nice.
It's working.
Perfect. Nice. Okay. In terms of embodiment, kind of a big thing that differentiates VRC users from the usual subject of social VR research in labs is that you guys embody main avatars for long periods of time that are extremely personalized and meaningful to you. There's a much more intense connection to VR avatars and VRC enthusiast circles than pretty much anywhere else. And this not only affects the meaning users attribute to their virtual bodies, but also how they are experienced and sensed. I make the argument that long-term VRChat users experience their virtual body very differently than newcomers. I describe this in more detail in the book, but roughly it works out like the process where people also get used to their spaces being bilocated. Initially, it's kind of a phase where your avatars are experienced in an embodied parallelism, where your body is kind of something external to you that you control and that's digitally wraps around you while you're in VR. This is how it works on paper, of course. You kind of control your body with tracking hardware. But once you start to embody the main avatar for longer, the experience of an oscillating body schema is increasingly common. These are moments where user's bodily perception is torn between the virtual and the physical body. For example, when your hands start twitching IRL when you want to make gestures, or in general, when you catch yourself doing things or feeling things that your avatar might be able to do or feel. The process eventually leads to a point where users become so familiar with their physical and virtual body that movements, behavior, and actions become second nature again. I trace these developments to the neuropsychological and sensorimotor self-discovery of infants, the time when children first figure out their body and what it can do. Essentially, long-term avatar embodiment forces VRC users to undergo that type of development a second time, until their body schema has sufficiently synthesized a sense of corporeal wholeness again. This is a major finding of the book, of course, because the current status quo of VR research is to think of VR embodiment as a body ownership illusion. But I found that this doesn't really apply to long-term VRChat users. They instead literally learn to incorporate their main avatars beyond any metaphorical sense. And with these first clues, one of my earliest questions about VRC also started to make a little bit more sense. Why are there so many mirrors? Infants have a mirror phase in the early development of their body schema as well, and their social identity, until they have grasped the scope of their bodies. In the book, I go over how this might be part of the reason for VRChat users' fascination with mirrors. I point out their role as a tool for autoscopic bodily self-discovery. However, I also heard in many interviews and experienced this myself that the individual reason is not always central to users. My interviewees have pointed out that they like to increase the awareness of the social situation around them when they're interacting with others in front of mirrors, kind of to see who is behind them or to see how they would look to others. In the book, I make the argument that this is connected, and that VRChat mirrors both serve the rediscovery of one's own body and one's social identity. In a VRChat mirror, you recognize your body as that of the avatar. That much is pretty easy to see. But you also become aware of your avatar as a social being, as me, when you can see yourself being part of social encounters with others. The mirror at once solidifies a bodily and a social identity in that way. I also have a section about phantom sensations in the book that might be interesting, but I can't go over all of that here. I just want to underline how this is tied to my main argument as well. So there are currently two major areas in which phantom sensations are being discussed in psychology and philosophy. One of them is about visuotactile experiments like the rubber hand, and the other is about phantom limb experiences, for example, of amputees. Everyone who was ever interested in phantom sense or phantom touch probably came across these examples when you Googled it. And I made the argument in the book that the phantom sense which long-term users feel is less of a visuotactile reflex, but more tied to the process of slowly incorporating aspects of one's avatar. And there's not much data out there, but the VRChat survey done by Brett Keener and Nem kind of suggests that as people's playtime increases, their chance to feel phantom sensations does as well, until it eventually stagnates. And this kind of underlines the point I'm trying to make in the book. So VRChat embodiment is processual. It starts to intensify once people choose a main avatar. And processes of hybridization eventually start there and then stagnate once people have synthesized a new sense of corporeal wholeness again. And that is the point at which one's body schema has incorporated the virtual body and its capabilities as its own. This process can be highly invasive at times and can affect how we perceive ourselves on and offline. Okay, you could ask the question at this point why a sociologist would spend over 100 pages of a book trying to analyze senses and impressions instead of social phenomena. But I do that mostly because it seemed necessary to explain all of these things to get a better understanding of how people in here interact and why. So I make the point in the book that the intense experiences of main avatars and VRChat worlds are deeply connected to how people in this platform interact. Long-term users experience their platform differently than other users, and that also affects their behavior, of course. Okay, so now comes the sociological, the last part of the book. It kind of takes info from what I talked about before as a baseline and then goes over what social behavior is like in VRChat and why that might be. I will start with some info about interaction theory here. In general, both social psychology and sociology treat interactions that happen offline differently than those that do occur online. This makes sense for the most part because there are many types of physically close interactions that can't be experienced online. They rely on the coordination of physical bodies in material spaces. And the general sense of bodily closeness is also something that can't just be replaced. It's something you can just feel when you're with someone IRL. And since the 80s, many sociologists have tried to translate what happens in chat rooms, virtual worlds, or social media into something of a scope that interaction theory or sociology can research. But that never really quite fully works out, since a true body-to-body starting point that we have always had offline seems to be missing most of the time. And this is what made VRChat so interesting to me initially, even in the videos I saw about the platform in 2017 and 2018. I could see that interactions seem to follow different rules than they would in other online spaces that I've been part of before. So I see everyday life among social VRChat users as a type of online sociality that is for the first time in history at a threshold point where we can observe a prototypical being followed in a virtual environment. This basically means that users enact face-to-face behavior inside VR, even when that might not be warranted in the eyes of the uninitiated. Social behavior inside the platform is modeled closely after what we would expect to happen in IRL spaces. I came up with multiple examples to showcase this in the book, and I want to highlight 3 of them today here. First of all, how users emphasize corporeal closeness in VRC, how they use bilocated body techniques casually, and how they get around tech issues that plague them every day. And I'll start with 1. So VRChat users emphasize corporality in many ways, but perhaps the most interesting is how they negotiate closeness and touch. Practices like head petting or hugs are very common, as all of you may know, but they have a role beyond being simple gestures that we all know from real life. In performing them, we affirm each other's virtual bodies as having corporeal value. Whether touch in VR is platonic or intimate, users accept their opposite's virtual body as corporeal enough to warrant this kind of offline behavior. And even if users just play along with these gestures, the dynamic behind them still affects everyone that is present. We can see this in the quote below, where one of my interviewees becomes aware of the depth of the encounter he shares with a friend after his friend hugs him. And Adrian becomes acutely aware of that closeness and friendship with that other person once that happens. The friend kind of infused the situation with corporality by implying that the hug would be warranted, which Adrian kind of affirms by hugging them back. At that point, the closeness of this shared moment becomes real in its consequences, even though it is not occurring offline. And VRC users can observe to imply corporeal weight and meaning in their interactions constantly. You can easily glance this when looking at how people treat personal spaces and boundaries in VRC. You can look at each other right now and see that you all leave each other's space and sit perfectly like in a lecture room, which is a good example of this. And in the social sciences, this kind of thing that you guys are all doing right now, so the personal space and the rules around how people should position themselves in a crowd or narrow spaces, that is often called proxemics. And even though users in VRChat are much less physically vulnerable than offline, the social rules that formed around reducing vulnerability and being tactful and being polite to others are still upheld in enthusiast circles. Users, for example, try to find a spot in a room and avoid running into others when moving around. And I've even seen people stand around awkwardly in virtual elevators before, or queue up in waiting lines. None of these things are technically necessary in a virtual world, but experienced VRChat users adhere to these rules nonetheless. It sends a clear message to everyone who enters a room full of trusted users. Bodies and spaces have a different value there. They are important, and social behavior is formed around that importance. So, and I have a thing with bilocated body techniques that's kind of tied to this in the book. I defined these as physical digital movements and techniques that long-term VRChat users quite often use in their everyday interactions, even though they are quite difficult to master and not really necessary on paper. And even some of them even require additional software like OVR to use or changes to one's avatar. And when you pay attention to them, you start seeing them everywhere. For example, when people reach for something IRL and do minimal adjustments to their position with their joysticks while physically moving. Or when you come in contact with long-term users who, basically when you come in contact with long-term users who can use these techniques and use them casually every day, it kind of showcases their physical body and material spaces, how they constantly shine through in their everyday behavior. The fact that these movements look visually more unpleasing than scripted movement and animations would look tells us a lot about what actually matters in VRChat. Corporality is expressed in VRChat by actually making one's physical body apparent through avatarial movement, not by scripting or animating perforant references of a body. And the third and last example I want to show are strategies that people in VRChat use to mitigate technological threats to their prototypical interactions in very creative ways. What I mean by that are all of the moments where people feel close and even intimate with one another, only for one of them to suddenly lose tracking or glitch out randomly. And these moments are disruptive to the behavior that long-term users enact inside VRChat. But they are only disruptive when they are collectively acknowledged as such. What I instead observed were a lot of workaround strategies where people reframe their disruptive tech issues, or where they try to find ways to get around the limitations of current VR tech to make situations work that should not work on paper. One of them is the normalization of tracking and network issues that plague VRChat users almost daily. It is culturally ingrained to at least outwardly accept these problems as normal occurrences and make light of them once they happen, either through jokes or by collectively and conveniently ignoring them. Tied to this are occurrences where users naturalize glitches affecting their virtual bodies. For example, here, the loss of tracking during ERP is positioned by Tammy as inherently human, like an accidental fart during sex. And then we have evidencing strategies. You probably have done this many times, or at least saw it happen with others. It's the moments in which people show you how aligned or mismatched they are with their avatar, or the occasions where some people tap on their drinks at home or something in their room to signal that they actually are interacting with that object. These are strategies to get around issues we are all dealing with current gen VR tech. When something isn't tracked or badly tracked, users get around that by giving evidence of it, and mostly auditory or verbally. Many of these conventions that I listed up here, and list up in the book even more, they add up to a safety net that makes interactions inside VR work for long-term users, even though they would be disruptive for any other type of VR user. And my overall argument from part 2 and part 3 of my book boils down to this. I have mentioned that long-term VRChat users gradually become more connected to their avatars and the worlds they regularly visit on a perceptual level. And I also explained how users can uphold an interaction order reminiscent of real life inside a virtual world. I came to the conclusion that both of the sensory and the behavioral aspects of long-term VR use are connected. The intense experience of embodiment and emplacement inside VRChat warrants prototypical interactions, but that's only half the equation. When you start being part of everyday interactions where users actually express this level of emplacement and corporality through their actions every day, what you and those around you feel is being socially affirmed constantly. This is what Beaufy and Berlin have called a virtuous circle, since it intensifies over time and sustains itself. As long as people keep acting according to the implicit behavioral rules that established VR communities all share, it continues. This is a theoretical tool that can be, for example, be used to explain why long-term VRChat users act and feel so differently compared to newcomers, or why VRChat users over time impart more and more meaning in the virtual worlds they visit and the avatars they embody. Okay, and now we go to the last chapter. After I spent most of the book basically explaining how life in VR functions, the last chapter in my book focuses on how it can become dysfunctional. I tie this section back to the academic texts about the social internet of the 90s and 2000s. And back then, a lot of the skepticism about life online centered around questions of trust and how anonymity and digital self-expression change how people place trust in others compared to offline encounters. And some of these issues resurface in VRChat because it is essentially an anonymous user-generated platform. They don't affect everyone, but mostly they have been mentioned to me in interviews when deeper or romantic relationships are concerned, or in general when people start to take their social lives inside this platform more seriously. In Chapter 8, I explore this topic, but my focus is lying a bit on what has changed from back in the day, really. So the main difference I see is that our mode of interaction has drastically changed since then. And in VRChat, users negotiate trust, sincerity, authenticity, and social identity while facing each other like IRL. This has never happened on the internet before. But at the same time, they kind of retain the levels of expressive control that user-generated worlds have always offered. I explain this in the book on the example of mute users. And don't worry, I make the distinction between voluntary and involuntary muteness. And I also go into a very detailed rundown of different types of muteness in VR. This is just a short summary. I investigate how VRChat users negotiate conflicts of social identity and face value by analyzing their encounters with mute users in VRChat. And I interviewed several mute users for this as well. I found that long-term users align somewhere between two poles in this regard. One of them being a heightened level of acceptance toward digital self-expression, and the other being a need for congruency, which is basically expressed whenever people demand info about the person behind the avatar. Option B is by far more common when we look at internet history. But the more interesting finding for me is that the first option also seems to work inside VRChat. Even though so much attention in here lies on behaving like IRL, users leave wiggle room when it comes to how they express as avatars, and can set the need for congruency aside in favor of more expressive freedom. This graphic is not in the book, by the way. I just made that to simplify what I mean. We can think of the negotiation of social identity and trust in VRChat as sitting somewhere between online and offline sociality. As a consequence, finding a balance in how long-term users present themselves in VRChat and how we interpret the self-presentations of others in this platform is not particularly easy. There are acceptable levels of anonymity and expressive control, like there were in anonymous platforms in the whole history of the internet. But at the same time, there are different threshold points in virtual face-to-face encounters at which these thresholds become intolerable. Sorry, my English. So debates around trust in VRChat communities often tackle this balance as well, which we can see whenever platform-wide verification or assurance, it's now called assurance, methods are being presented, for example. And I don't have an answer for how this could best be navigated in the future of VRChat, but in the book, I point to a theoretical perfect balance state, and I will quote myself from the book here. It's the point where the utopian, trans, and post-human promises of a virtual community can still be realized in prototypical social settings. And now we're coming to the last slide of this presentation, and I want to close things out by answering my initial research questions. So long-term VRChat users experience virtual worlds as distinct social sites and are deeply connected to their main avatars, to the point where they experience alterations in their body schemata and images. The reason for this is a long-term process of physical-digital synthesis that is started by the experiences of corporeal bilocation whilst wearing VR gear, but only intensifies through lived experience and constant social affirmation. I call this the virtuous circle, as both the social and experiential aspect of this process are linked. VRChat users would not experience their worlds or bodies in the same way they do right now if they were socially isolated. In terms of how users shape and negotiate their everyday social interactions, established VRC communities construct their behavior closely according to real-world blueprints and silently, often unknowingly, protect this prototypical interaction order against disruptive influences, either through corporeal and proximal behavior itself or by means of circumspection strategies. Long-term VRChat users stretch the boundaries of real-world interactions and face value only in terms of their expressive capabilities, which is closely aligned to anonymous 90s and 2000s user-generated virtual worlds. The user base is not interested in presenting as digital twins to their offline selves, and instead they realize techno-utopian as well as trans and post-human potentials by practicing self-experimentation in an otherwise corporeally close everyday sociality. And that is it. Thank you, guys. And these are my sources for this presentation. If you want almost 40 pages more sources like this, you can check out the bibliography of my book. And yeah. I don't know how much time. Oh, I was almost on time, guys. Nice.